The judge leaned in, his voice dripping with disdain as he eyed her red coat like it was a crime scene. "Miss Leavitt, are you lost? This isn't a fashion show." The courtroom froze. Jaws tightened, pens stopped mid-scribble, and every eye turned to the young attorney who, by all appearances, had just been publicly humiliated. But then she looked up and smiled. What happened next will shock even those who thought they'd seen everything. But first, let's go back to the beginning. The courtroom crackled with an invisible electricity, not from the legal arguments scribbled across the docket, but from the audacity of a color. In a sea of charcoal suits and beige conformity, Karoline Leavitt's coat blazed like a defiant banner. Cranberry red, double-breasted, cinched at the waist with a belt that bore the patina of time, it didn't just speak. It declared. A vintage piece from her grandmother, who had marched in protests and taught her that power wasn't something given, but taken, stitch by stitch, word by word. The coat was more than an accessory. It was lineage. Karoline entered with measured steps, her heels muffled by the dense courtroom carpet, her expression calm, but her pulse thudding like a war drum. At just 29, this was her first federal-level oral argument. She'd prepped for weeks, memorizing precedents, crafting layered constitutional reasoning, simulating every possible question. But nothing could have prepared her for the insult that would be hurled not at her mind, but at her appearance. Judge Thomas Rourke, an institutional monolith with silver hair and a gaze like a chisel, leaned forward slightly on the bench. He didn't look at her case file. He looked at her, head to toe. Then his lip curled with theatrical disdain. "Well, Miss Leavitt," he said, loud enough for the stenographer's keys to pause mid-strike. "I hope your legal arguments are stronger than your fashion sense. You look more like you're ready for a Vogue photo shoot than a federal hearing." A hushed ripple moved through the gallery. An intern coughed into his sleeve to hide a grin. An older male attorney leaned back with the kind of smirk men reserve for witnessing what they believe to be a lesson. Karoline didn't blink. She didn't speak, but a steel plate slammed into place behind her eyes. The insult was public, but the message was private. Rourke's words dripped with the kind of venom only experience could detect, not aimed at the coat, but at the audacity it represented. Her youth, her femininity, her refusal to shrink to fit the mold he had spent decades shaping. He didn't see a capable attorney. He saw a challenge to his order, a disruption wrapped in red wool. Beneath her silence, Karoline's thoughts sharpened like knives. She understood then that this courtroom wouldn't be won solely by logic or law. It would demand something deeper, a war waged on two fronts, constitutional clarity and cultural combat, and she was ready. And Karoline Leavitt hadn't come to court unarmed. She arrived not just with a binder of constitutional citations, but with a surgical understanding of her adversary's psyche. Judge Thomas Rourke was a creature of habit, prestige, and unchallenged power. 37 years on the federal bench had bred not only arrogance, but a tactical blindness, a belief that authority was virtue and seniority was immunity. He ruled like a monarch, and no one in his courtroom dared test the edges of his throne. But Karoline had studied him like a living case file. She had pored over transcripts from his past rulings, noting the subtle, and sometimes overt, patterns in his language. How he cut off younger attorneys mid-sentence, how his tone would chill whenever a woman dared to raise a voice or dissent. She knew the data, yes, but more than that, she knew his rhythm, his cadence of cruelty, his passive-aggressive rhetoric dressed in legal robes. She didn't come to this courtroom to merely present her argument. She came to unmask his comfort. So when she took the floor, it was with deliberate control, not cold, but unflinching. Her voice was neither loud nor timid, but sharp as a tuning fork. and her first word set the courtroom spine straight. "Your Honor, if the court is concerned with appearances, let me assure you, the Constitution is not fashion-dependent." A ripple broke through the still air. It wasn't laughter. It was tension exhaled, an acknowledgement from the walls themselves that something new was taking root. Then, like a pianist striking into Rachmaninoff, she played. Every clause, every footnote, every citation landed with force. She drew from 19th century minority opinions, pulled threads from dissents that hadn't seen daylight in decades, and wove them seamlessly into a modern constitutional framework. The government's argument didn't just look weak. Under Karoline's scrutiny, it looked fraudulent. Rourke tried to interject. She was ready. He tried again. She parried. Each time she met him not with deference, but with clinical precision. There was no trembling, no flattery, no hedging, only facts, only law. His mask of condescension began to crack. "Miss Leavitt," he snapped, "I remind you to maintain decorum." Her reply came not as rebellion, but as pure logic, cool and irrefutable. "Decorum, Your Honor, begins with respect, including respect for a counsel's appearance and focus on legal merit, not wardrobe." There it was. The pivot. Not defiance, but redefinition. Not protest, but precedent. From the gallery, pens scratched faster. Recorders clicked on. Journalists stopped observing and started witnessing. Even the clerk hesitated, eyes flitting between the bench and the young woman who, without raising her voice, was unseating a legacy. And still, Karoline pressed forward, not for spectacle, not for applause, but because she had prepared. The real twist came when Karoline did something few dared. She filed a mid-hearing objection against the judge. Using an obscure clause from the Judicial Code of Conduct, she raised a formal issue of bias, citing not only his opening insult but his record of dismissing cases involving young female lawyers with alarming frequency. She presented statistical data, names, quotes from previous transcripts. Gasps turned into silence. Even the opposing counsel looked stunned. Judge Rourke turned red, then pale. "This is outrageous," he barked. "Not as outrageous as disrespecting this court's own rules, Your Honor," Karoline replied, calm as ever. The court adjourned. For the first time in 20 years, Judge Rourke was forced to recuse himself from a case. The morning sun hadn't yet cleared the skyline when the story broke. It moved not like a whisper, but like a tidal wave, surging through legal blogs, news tickers, and social feeds with unstoppable velocity. The coat, once dismissed as a courtroom distraction, had become a banner headline. Coatgate. Young lawyer outsmarts arrogant federal judge in viral courtroom clash. Karoline Leavitt stuns legal world. A courtroom moment for the ages. Judicial smackdown. Tradition meets its match in red wool. Screens lit up across the country with the now famous image. Karoline, chin tilted slightly upward, mid-sentence, eyes locked on the bench, her coat defiant against the drab backdrop of judicial gray. She hadn't planned to become a symbol. She had planned to argue a case. But symbols have a way of choosing themselves. By noon, inboxes overflowed, not just with praise, but with a kind of reverence. Messages from retired justices, public defenders, and law professors who had seen their own careers stifled by institutional arrogance. Attorneys who had once bit their tongues now quoted Karoline's courtroom line with fervor. Law students posted videos reenacting her delivery. Hashtags like #CoatLikeKaroline and #justice. In style trending, as if the legal system itself had been made pop culturally digestible. The American Bar Association, typically glacial in pace, issued a tersely worded bulletin emphasizing, The essential role of judicial neutrality and professionalism, particularly with regard to personal decorum and gendered commentary. It was bloodless language, but everyone knew what and who it meant. And through it all, Karoline said nothing. She didn't do interviews, didn't claim vindication. She had no appetite for the performance of victory. Her silence was louder than any viral clip. It was the silence of someone who understood that true triumph isn't a tweet, it's a shift in expectation. The following week she returned to court. Same building, different case. And yes, the same coat. No flashier, no brighter, just as red, just as deliberate. To some, it was an act of bold repetition. To others, an unspoken challenge. But for Karoline, it was neither. It was a reminder. A quiet, immovable truth stitched into every seam. That respect, like law, isn't about optics. It's about substance. As she took her seat at counsel's table, several eyes in the gallery watched closely. But this time, no one laughed. No one sneered. Because in that courtroom and far beyond it, a line had been drawn. Not in sand, but in crimson wool. And everyone knew, crossing it again wouldn't end well.